The fog lay thick as wool upon Copenhagen harbour. That October morning in 1936, out beyond Nyhavn, where colourful houses bled into grey water, the luxury yacht Sirena rocked gently at her moorings. And there, impaled upon her own carved mermaid figurehead, hung the body of Harold Grun, one of Denmark's richest shipowners. A harpoon of ancient iron pierced his chest. His lifeless arms spread wide as though embracing the sea that had made his fortune. Chapter 1. The Mermaid Weeps. The fog that cloaked Copenhagen on the morning of the 17th of October, 1936, was not the gentle, drifting mist of postcards. It was a living thing, thick, wet and bitter with coal smoke and the breath of the Øresund. It pressed against the coloured facades of Nyhavn, until the red and yellow houses looked bruised. It swallowed sound, so that the clang of a ship's bell 2 streets away arrived like the tolling of a drowned cathedral. At precisely 23 minutes past 7, a single scream cut through the murk, sharp enough to make the gulls rise in a clattering cloud from the rigging of the 3-masted schooners. The scream belonged to old Jens Petersen, night watchman for the Grun private dock, and it would be the last ordinary sound he ever made. He had found his employer. Out beyond the forest of bare masts, the luxury steam yacht Sirena lay at her moorings like a sleeping swan. 85 feet of gleaming white hull, teak decks holy stoned every dawn, brass that could blind a man when the sun finally remembered Denmark. Upon her bowsprit, carved in the year 1836 by a master from Bergen, was the famous mermaid figurehead. Bare-breasted, hair streaming, tail curled in eternal grace, and impaled upon the iron spike that had once held a lantern for the helmsman, hung Harold Grun himself. The richest shipowner in Scandinavia was dressed only in crimson silk pyjamas and a dressing gown of midnight blue. His arms were flung wide as though he embraced the figurehead in a final, grotesque dance. An ancient whaling harpoon, black iron, 6 feet of it, had been driven through his chest with such violence that the barbed head protruded 4 inches from his back. Blood had sheeted down the carved mermaid's torso, staining her wooden scales the colour of fresh garnets. It still dripped, slow and deliberate, into the black water beneath. Plink, plink, plink. The rhythm was almost gentle, like a clock that measured something far older than minutes. Jens Petersen stood on the quayside, mouth working soundlessly. His lantern had fallen and gone out. The only light came from the riding lamps of the yachts, trembling on the water like guilty stars. Somewhere inside the fog, a woman began to sing. Low, mournful in the old tongue. Das sah den Haufruhe på klippen den rød, hun kæmmede sit gyldne hår. A mermaid sat on the red rock, combing her golden hair. The voice was not loud, yet it carried with terrible clarity, as though the fog itself had learned the Ausje song centuries ago, and now repeated it out of habit. At that same hour, in the royal suite of the Hôtel d'Angleterre, Hercule Poirot was finishing his morning chocolate. He wore a dressing gown of quilted plum silk and a small green eyeshade against the electric light. On the table before him lay a telegram delivered by hand at 6 o'clock. Urgent. Harold Grun murdered in impossible circumstances aboard his yacht Sirena. Danish police baffled. Come at once. Personal request. Andreas Müller, prefect of police and old friend. Poirot set down the cup with a delicate clink. He disliked boats. He disliked cold. He disliked the entire concept of Scandinavia in autumn. Yet the little grey cells, they stirred like cats stretching after a long sleep. Impossible circumstances, he murmured, stroking the magnificent moustache that had made him famous from Constantinople to Caracas. One does not refuse such an invitation. By 8:30, he was in a black Daimler flying the Belgian diplomatic pennant, racing along the coastal road toward Nieuwhoorn with a police siren wailing ahead. The fog thinned just enough to reveal the harbour, and there lay the Sirena, surrounded now by launches and the blue uniforms of the Kopenhagen's-Politi. A tall young man, with the pale hair and tragic eyes of a Viking prince, waited on the quay. Inspector Anders Müller, 34 years old, already spoken of as the coming man of Danish investigation, greeted Poirot with the restrained enthusiasm of a Lutheran at a funeral. Monsieur Poirot, you honour us. I studied your methods at the Academy. The case of the Oriental Ruby. Later, mon cher inspecteur, Poirot said, raising a gloved hand. First, one must see. They went aboard by the accommodation ladder. The deck smelled of wet teak and blood. Sailors stood about in awkward silence. One crossed himself repeatedly, though Denmark had been Protestant these 400 years. Poirot stopped beneath the figurehead. He was small, neat, dandified. The dead man was tall even in death. Harold Grun's head had fallen forward. His thinning fair hair hung in strands across the mermaid's wooden breasts. His eyes were open, pale blue, already filmed. Yet there was something almost serene in the expression, as though he had finally recognized an old acquaintance. Poirot studied the harpoon. It was a museum piece, the iron pitted with age, the shaft bound with tarred hemp, the barbs hand-forged. A small brass plate near the socket read, "Taken from the whale Fortuna, 1851, property of P. Grun and Sonner. Removed from the main saloon last night," Inspector Müller explained quietly. "It hung above the fireplace for 50 years. The brackets are empty." Poirot's gaze travelled downward. The deck beneath the body was clean, except for a single set of bare footprints. Harold Grun's own, leading from the companionway to the rail. No other marks, no struggle. "And the doors?" Poirot asked. "The only door from the saloon to the deck was bolted on the inside. The portholes are 20 inches across. No man could pass. The crew sleeps ashore since the refit. The night watchman saw nothing until dawn. The yacht was locked, monsieur. Locked from within, yet the owner is out here, pinned like a butterfly." Poirot removed his hat and placed it carefully on a bollard. He took a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, pressed it to his nose against the smell of blood and brine, and looked up again at the mermaid. She was beautiful in the northern way, not the soft prettiness of Mediterranean art, but something harder. More dangerous, the carver had given her high cheekbones, a mouth that was almost smiling, and eyes that seemed to follow you even though they were only painted wood. Real tears of condensation hung from the lower lids like diamonds. "Regardez," Poirot whispered. "She weeps." Müller gave a polite, embarrassed cough. "Condensation, surely." "Or remorse," said Poirot. From somewhere below came the faint, haunting strain of the mermaid song again. Both men turned. It seemed to rise through the very timbers of the ship. "One of the crew playing a joke," Müller suggested. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Or someone who wishes us to believe in mermaids." He moved toward the companionway. The bolts on the saloon door were heavy bronze, thrown from the inside. No sign of forcing. Inside, the saloon was exactly as a rich man's seagoing drawing room should be. Mahogany panelling, oil paintings of clippers under full sail, a fireplace with green tiles from Delft. Above the mantel, 2 empty iron brackets gaped like accusing fingers. Poirot walked slowly, his patent leather shoes making no sound on the Persian carpet. He paused at the fireplace, touched the brackets, then knelt. Yes, there. A faint scratch on the teak floorboards, as though something heavy had been dragged no more than 6 inches. And caught in a crack, almost invisible, a single long hair, the colour of ripe wheat. He straightened, pocketed the hair in a small envelope, and turned to Muller. "Tell me, Inspecteur, who inherits if Harold Grun dies without issue?" Muller hesitated. "There is complication. A new will was signed only yesterday. Everything, the ships, the palaces, the fortune, goes to the National Maritime Museum. The family is furious. The old will favoured his brother's widow and his captain of 30 years. The new will disinherits them both." Poirot's eyebrows rose like the wings of a startled bird. And where were these disinherited persons last night? Captain Frederick Larsen was drinking aquavit in the Seaman's Mission until 2. The widow, Fru Ingrid Sørensen, is on Bornholm, or so she claims. There are others, a business rival named Kjeldsen, the family doctor who owed money, a folklorist who quarrelled publicly with Grun over mermaid legends. Poirot raised a via hand. Enough. One begins to see the shape, but first. He crossed to a gramophone in the corner. On the turntable rested a new shellac record. The label read, Havfruens Klage, traditional Danish ballad, recorded Copenhagen, September 1936. Poirot lifted the needle gently. The cabin fell silent, except for the slap of water against the hull. "Someone," he said softly, "prepared the stage most carefully. The locked room, the ancient weapon, the weeping mermaid, the song in the fog. It is all, how do you say, too picturesque. One is meant to think of curses and sea spirits." He smiled suddenly, a small cat-like smile of pure delight. But Hercule Poirot, he does not believe in mermaids. He believes in murderers. And this murderer has made one tiny mistake already. He tapped the envelope containing the blonde hair. "Tell me, Inspecteur, is Fru Ingrid Sørensen blonde?" "Like summer corn," Muller said grimly. "Alors, we have work to do." Far out in the fog, a bellboy clanged once, as though something ancient had turned over in its sleep. And somewhere beneath the keel of the Sirena, the mermaid song began again, softer now, almost amused. Chapter 2. The 5 who stood to gain the offices of Grun Rederi A.S. occupied a narrow 4-story building on the corner of Tolbodgård and the harbour basin, its facade the colour of oxblood and its windows trimmed with black iron like mourning ribbons. On the morning of the 18th of October, 1936, the brass nameplate still bore the proud inscription, Harold Grun, Directeur, but inside, the heart of the empire was already cold. Hercule Poirot entered at 11 o'clock precisely, removing his galoshes with fastidious care in the marble vestibule. Inspector Muller followed, carrying a leather folio stuffed with statements, fingerprints, and the first grim photographs of the corpse. A uniformed clerk, eyes red from weeping or aquavit or both, led them up the curving walnut staircase to the director's suite on the top floor. The air smelled of cigar smoke, sealing wax, and something metallic that Poirot recognized at once: fear. The room was vast and masculine, charts of the North Atlantic pinned to the walls like captured enemies, ship models in glass cases, a globe the size of a bishop's belly. In the centre stood a long table of polished oak. Around it waited the 5 people who had most wished Harold Grun dead, and who now, by the cruel caprice of a dying man's pen, had gained nothing at all. Poirot took the chair at the head of the table, Harold Grun's own chair, without apology. The little Belgian looked almost comical in the tall leather throne, feet barely touching the floor. Yet no one smiled. Power, Poirot knew, is measured not in inches but in certainty. Mesdames, messieurs, he began, folding his gloved hands, we are gathered not for a funeral but for a resurrection, the resurrection of truth. I am Hercule Poirot. You know why I'm here. One of you killed Harold Grun. The others merely profited from the possibility. Let us discover which is which. He turned first to the man on his immediate right. Captain Frederick Larsen was 62, built like a Jutland ox, beard the colour of frost on iron. 35 years he had served the Grun line, rising from cabin boy to master. His hands resting on the table were scarred from rope and ice, the nails broken, the knuckles swollen. He wore his old uniform, the gold braid tarnished, the left sleeve empty of the company crest that Harold had ordered removed 3 weeks ago. Captain Larsen, Poirot said gently, you were promised the Sirena upon your retirement, were you not? A gentleman's agreement, sealed with a handshake and a glass of Linney aquavit. Larsen's voice was gravel dragged across a reef. He gave me his word in front of witnesses. Then, last month, he laughed and said a museum would make better use of her. A museum? My ship, monsieur. My home. I have no wife, no children. Only the sea and the Sirena, and now neither. Where were you on the night of the 16th? In the Seaman's Mission at Nehaven 51. Drunk, yes, I admit it. I drank until the barman threw me out at 2. 20 men will swear to it. Poirot inclined his head. We shall verify, but a man may hire murder as easily as he buys aquavit, non? Larsen's eyes blazed. I'm a sailor, not a snake. Next, the woman to Larsen's left. Fru Ingrid Sørensen was 28, and grief became her the way moonlight becomes the sea. Her morning dress was Paris black, severe yet clinging, the veil thrown back to reveal hair, the colour of midsummer wheat braided tightly against her skull. Her eyes were the pale, merciless blue of a glacier's heart. Madame, Poirot said, 5 years ago, your husband, Harold's younger brother Eric, vanished overboard from the freighter Nordlyse during a storm off the Shetlands. No body was recovered. Harold inherited everything. Many said it was convenient. Ingrid's voice could have frozen brandy. Many said many things, Monsieur Poirot. My husband was washed overboard. Accidents happen at sea. Harold comforted me in my grief. For a time we were close. Then he tired of me, as men do. The new will cuts me off entirely. I lose the house in Hellerup, the allowance, everything. So yes, I had reason to hate him. But I was on Bornholm, visiting my aunt. The ferry logs will prove it. Poirot studied her gloved hands. The left thumb bore a fresh scratch, as though from a thorn, or from climbing the carved hair of a wooden mermaid. Bornholm is not so very far, he murmured. A fast motor launch could make the crossing in darkness. Ingrid smiled without warmth. Then find it, little man. Third, the businessman. Magnus Kjeldsen was 45, sleek and scented, the only man in Copenhagen who wore a Homburg hat indoors. His company, Kjeldsen and Son, had offered 3 million kroner for Grunrederi only last month. Harold had laughed in his face at the board meeting and poured champagne over the contract. Kjeldsen lit a gold-tipped cigarette with a lighter shaped like a ship's propeller. Harold was a dinosaur, Monsieur Poirot. Steam is finished. Oil is the future. I wanted his roots, his docks, his name. With him dead, the heirs might have sold. Instead, thanks to this idiotic museum will, the whole empire is frozen for years. So you see, his death inconveniences me more than anyone. And where were you, monsieur? At the opera, Don Carlo, box 7. The Lord Chamberlain sat beside me the entire evening. Afterward, supper at the English Club until 4. 50 witnesses, all sober enough to matter. Poirot's eyes flicked to the man's shoes, handmade, London last, yet the left sole bore a faint smear of tar. Ni haven tar. 4th, the doctor. Dr. Einar Blum was thin to the point of transparency, his spectacles perpetually sliding down a nose that trembled like a rabbit's. He had been the Grun family physician for 15 years. His hands shook as he laid a small morocco case on the table. Harold suffered from nervous dyspepsia, he said too quickly. I prescribed bromide and a mild tonic, nothing more. Poirot opened the case. Inside lay a hypodermic syringe and 3 ampules labelled thallium acetate, for research only. Curious tonic, Doctor. Thallium is a rat poison. In small doses, it causes hair loss, paralysis, madness. In larger doses, death over weeks. Harold's hair was thinning rapidly these past months, was it not? And his temper? Erratic. Bloom went the colour of tallow. I kept it for experiments on laboratory animals. Harold discovered I had financial difficulties. He lent me money. Then he threatened to expose certain irregularities in my prescriptions. He was poisoning me, monsieur, slowly, to keep me in his power. A collective intake of breath circled the table. Poirot closed the case with a soft snap. We shall analyse the brandy decanter from the Sirena. And your fingerprints, Doctor. Are they upon the harpoon brackets, perhaps? Bloom began to weep without sound. Finally, the woman who had not yet spoken. Solveig Wang was 33, tall, dressed in a coat of sealskin that smelled of the Faroes. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, braided with tiny silver fish bones. She was the author of 3 books on Nordic sea folklore, and had quarrelled violently with Harold Grun only a fortnight ago at the university. He had called her work superstitious nonsense for tourists. She had called him a blasphemer who carves mermaids for vanity and forgets their price. She laid a small bundle wrapped in blue silk on the table and unwrapped it. Inside was a single white lily and a piece of driftwood carved into a tiny mermaid, no longer than a man's finger. The figurehead aboard the Sirena was carved in 1836, she said quietly. Every 100 years the sea demands a life from the family that owns her. Harold laughed. He said science had killed the old gods. But the old gods do not die so easily. Her eyes, grey as winter water, met Poirot's without flinching. I was aboard the Sirena yesterday afternoon, photographing the carving for my new book. Harold himself showed me the hollow space inside the mermaid. An old smuggler's trick, he boasted. I left at 5. After that, she shrugged, ask the sea. Poirot picked up the tiny carved mermaid. It was warm from her hand. On its breast, someone had scratched with a knife point the date, 16 to 10, 1936. He wrapped it again in the silk and placed it in his pocket. 5 motives, he said softly. 5 alibis, some stronger than others, a locked yacht, a singing ghost, and a dead man who arranged his own disinheritance the very day before he died. It is, mes amis, what you call in Denmark en rigtig suppe, a proper soup. He rose, small and immaculate. Inspector Müller and I will now examine the new will, the brandy decanter, the tar on Monsieur Keltson's shoe, the scratch on Madame Sörenson's thumb, and the good doctor's interesting medicine chest. One of you has lied about more than an alibi. One of you has arranged a murder so elaborate that it almost persuades even Hercule Poirot that mermaids can kill. He paused at the door, looking back at the 5 pale faces. But almost, mesdames et messieurs, is never enough. As Poirot descended the staircase, The clocks of Copenhagen began to strike noon, and somewhere far below, in the cellars that opened directly onto the harbour, the water slapped against stone with the slow, patient rhythm of something that has waited 100 years and can wait 100 more. Chapter 3. The Impossible Cabin. The Sirena lay quiet under a pale midday sun that had finally burned a hole through the fog. Gulls wheeled overhead, screaming like unpaid creditors. Poirot and Inspector Müller descended the companionway into the main saloon, the air inside still heavy with the ghost of blood and expensive cigars. Poirot moved with the reverence of a priest entering a cathedral. Nothing escaped him. The alignment of the chairs, the faint ring on the table where a glass had stood too long, the way the Persian carpet bore the ghost of a dragged heel. "Regardez," he murmured, pointing to the empty iron brackets above the fireplace. "The harpoon was taken from here, yes? Yet observe the dust. On the left bracket, a perfect crescent of dust remains. On the right, it is smeared. The weapon was lifted, not pulled straight down, but swung outward in an arc. Someone tall did this, or someone standing on something." Müller measured the height, 6 feet at least to swing freely. "Captain Larsen is 6'3", the inspector added grimly. Poirot only smiled and knelt. Beneath the brackets, on the teak decking, ran the faint scratch he had noticed yesterday, no longer than 4 inches, but straight as a ruler, ending at a knot in the wood. He pressed the knot. Nothing. He pressed harder. A soft click. A narrow panel, no wider than a folio volume, slid aside, revealing a black cavity. "Mon Dieu," Müller breathed, "a false compartment." "More than that," Poirot said. "Regard the brass runner, polished bright by recent use. Someone has been coming and going in secret." He took an electric torch from his overcoat and shone it inside. The space was lined with cedar, smelling of old rum and secrets. At the far end, a vertical ladder of iron rungs disappeared upward into darkness. "Where does it lead?" Müller asked. Poirot was already climbing, nimble as a boy despite the tightness of his patent shoes. 10 rungs up, the ladder opened into the hollow core of the Mermaid Figurehead itself. The cavity was just large enough for a slender man to crouch. Light entered through the carved mouth and eyes of the mermaid, giving the space an eerie green glow, as though one knelt inside an aquarium. From this height, Poirot could look straight down onto the foredeck where Harold Grun had died. A circular hatch, no bigger than a dinner plate, lay directly beneath the figurehead's breast. It was closed now, but the screws showed fresh scratches. "Someone hid here," Poirot whispered, voice echoing strangely inside the wood, waited until Harold stepped beneath, opened the hatch, and drove the harpoon downward with both hands. Gravity did the rest. Then the murderer closed the hatch, descended the ladder, slid the panel shut, and walked away. The saloon remained bolted from the inside. Perfect. He climbed down again, eyes glittering. But the harpoon was kept in the saloon. How did the killer get it up there beforehand without being seen? Müller pointed to a coil of thin fishing line still dangling from one rung. "Lowered it on this, hauled it up like a fish." Poirot nodded, then froze. Something glinted on the floor of the secret compartment. A single blonde hair, caught on a splinter. He plucked it free with tweezers and held it to the light. It was long, fine, and unmistakably dyed at the root, the natural colour showing grey beneath the gold. "Dr. Blom is going bald," Müller said slowly. "He dyes what remains." "Précisément." They returned to the saloon. Poirot now examined the gramophone more closely. The record of the mermaid's song had been played so often that the grooves were worn white in places. Someone had stood here for hours, listening to that haunting voice, perhaps rehearsing terror. On the table lay Harold Grunn's appointment diary, open to the 16th of October. A single entry in red ink. 11 p.m. Settle everything with E.B. Einar Bloom. Yet beneath the diary, someone had slipped a folded sheet of heavyweight cream paper, the Grun letterhead. Poirot unfolded it carefully. It was a suicide note. I can no longer bear the voices in the fog. The mermaid calls me as she called my brother. Forgive me, Harold Grun. The handwriting matched perfectly, yet the ink was still faintly tacky. Written yesterday, perhaps only hours before death. Forged, Müller said at once, to make us think he impaled himself in madness. Or, Poirot said softly, written by Harold himself when he realized he was being poisoned and wished to cheat his enemies of victory by donating everything to the museum, a final act of spite. He slipped the note into an envelope. One last discovery. In the wastepaper basket, crumpled and then smoothed out again, a telegram. To Harold Grun, Serena, Copenhagen, you will die before the new moon. The mermaid remembers. Signed one who knows, sent from the Central Post Office at 9:17 p.m. the previous night. No signature, no fingerprints paid in cash. Möller's face was grim. Solveig Vang again. She's mad enough. Or someone clever enough to make us think so. Poirot stood in the centre of the saloon and slowly turned full circle, letting the little grey cells drink in every detail. The bolted door, the empty brackets, the hidden ladder, the forged note, the dyed hair, the mermaid singing through the mouth of a dead woman on a shellac disc. 3 impossibilities have become one possibility, he announced. The locked room is no longer locked. The question is no longer how, but who knew the secret of the Hollow Mermaid? He looked up suddenly, as though the carved figurehead 30 feet above could hear him. And why, mes amis, did Harold Grun arrange to meet his poisoner at 11 o'clock on the very night he planned to die, by his own hand? Outside, the sun vanished again behind cloud. The temperature dropped sharply, and from somewhere deep in the timbers of the Serena came the faintest echo, as though a woman trapped inside the wood had drawn breath to sing once more. Chapter 4. The song in the fog night fell early in Copenhagen that October, as though the city itself wished to hide what it had seen. By 8 o'clock, the fog returned thicker than before, swallowing the street lamps of Nihan until each glowed like a drowning moon. Hercule Poirot walked alone along the quayside, collar turned up, stick tapping a measured rhythm on the wet cobbles. He had dismissed Inspector Müller with a polite but firm "Non, mon ami, tonight Poirot hunts the song." And the song was hunting him. It began as the faintest thread of sound, carried on the wind from the direction of the old Freeport warehouses. A woman's voice, low and aching, singing the same ancient ballad that had floated across the water at dawn. Der Sarden have fru på klippen den rød. Hun kemmelt sitt gyldne hår. Poirot followed it past shuttered customs houses and mountains of crated cargo, past the sleeping cranes that looked like hanged giants. The warehouses grew older, their brick blackened by a century of coal, smoke. Number 17 had once belonged to the Grun Company. Harold had sold it last year to pay debts no one was meant to know about. The padlock on the side door hung open, the hasp freshly cut. Inside, the air was cold and sour with the smell of the sea trapped indoors. Poirot's torch picked out broken packing cases, coils of rotten rope, and, in the centre of the cavernous space, a single pool of yellow light beneath a hanging bulb. Solveig Vang sat there on an upturned crate, wrapped in her sealskin coat, hair unbound and black as midnight water. Before her stood an American Victor gramophone, its green felt turntable spinning, the same shellac record from the Sirena played, the needle riding the worn groove with a soft hiss. She did not startle when Poirot stepped into the light. "You followed her voice," she said simply. "Most men do." "Or I followed yours, mademoiselle." Solveig lifted the needle. Silence rushed in like tide. "I often come here," she said. "This warehouse once stored the figureheads of ships that never returned. Their mermaids are stacked in the cellar, blind and forgotten. I play the song so they remember they were once beautiful." Poirot moved closer. On the floor lay open notebooks filled with meticulous sketches of the Sirena's mermaid, measurements, runes, comparisons to carvings in Stavanger and Torshavn. Beside them, a stack of freshly printed handbills. The Mermaid's Curse, public lecture by Solveig Vang, 22nd October. "You profit from the legend," Poirot observed. "Someone must keep the old stories alive." Her grey eyes were steady. Harold Grun mocked them. He said wood is wood, and the sea is only water. Now he is pinned to the wood he despised, and the sea has drunk his blood. That is balance. Poirot picked up one of the notebooks. A pressed white lily marked a page. Beneath a drawing of the figurehead, someone had written in red ink, 1936, the 100th year. The debt falls due. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did you send the telegram that arrived on the Sirena yesterday? The one promising death before the new moon?" "I sent no telegram." She smiled faintly. "But I dreamed it. Dreams and telegrams sometimes travel by the same current." Poirot's torch swept the shadows. In the corner stood a wooden crate stenciled "Property of National Museum, return immediately." The lid was pried open. Inside lay the original bills of sale for the Serena's figurehead, dated 1836, and a small oilskin packet. He opened it carefully. Photographs, a dozen of them. Harold Grun, younger, drunk, laughing, forcing a much younger Solveig Vang, barely 20, into the hollow of the newly restored mermaid, while party guests applauded. Another photograph showed Harold sealing the cavity with a temporary panel, trapping her inside for nearly an hour as a joke. Her face in the final picture was pale, streaked with tears, eyes wide with terror. Poirot felt something cold settle in his chest. "You were the first to discover the hollow space," he said quietly. Harold thought it amusing to frighten a superstitious girl from the Faroes. He said if I screamed, the mermaid would answer. I screamed. Nothing answered. Her voice never rose. Years later, I returned to measure her properly for my book. The cavity was still there. Harold had forgotten. I never did. She stood, tall as a ship's mast. "Leave the dead to the dead, Monsieur Poirot. Some debts are not paid in courtrooms." Poirot replaced the photographs exactly as he found them. "Yet someone used your song, your legend, your nightmare, to commit murder. That I cannot leave." Solveig walked past him toward the door. At the threshold, she paused. "Listen," she whispered. Far away, across the black water, the Serena's bell gave one mournful clang, though no wind stirred. Then came the song again, not from the gramophone, not from Solveig, but from the harbour itself, thin and sweet and impossible. Solveig's eyes filled with sudden tears. "She sings for herself now," she said. "The mermaid has her captain at last." She vanished into the fog. Poirot stood alone with the silent gramophone and the smell of old terror. After a long moment, he lifted the needle arm, removed the record, and slipped it inside his overcoat. Evidence, he told himself. But as he stepped back into the night, the little Belgian could not quite silence the thought that some songs are older than justice, and some debts are collected by hands that have never been human. Chapter 5. The Poison in the Port. At 9 o'clock the following morning, the police laboratory in the Politigorden smelled of ether, coffee, and defeat. Inspector Müller laid the report on Poirot's desk like a dead fish. "Thallium," he said flatly. "In the stomach contents, in the blood, in the half-empty glass of Sonderman 27, found beside Harold Grun's bed. Chronic poisoning for at least 6 weeks. Then a massive final dose in the port. Enough to kill a horse." Poirot read the figures twice, moustache bristling. Chronic first, then acute. Someone wished him to suffer before he died. That is hatred, not mere convenience. He placed the report beside another folder. Dr. Einar Blum's complete medical file, obtained at dawn under warrant. Page after page of trembling handwriting. Prescriptions for morphine, for cocaine, for barbiturates. All forged for sale on the black market. Debts listed in red ink totalled more than Harold Grun's yacht. Poirot tapped a photograph clipped to the file. Blum at a charity ball last year, almost skeletal, eyes sunken, the remaining hair dyed an unconvincing gold. "Regardez les cheveux," Poirot murmured. "Thallium alopecia. The doctor has been dosing himself by accident or design." Müller produced a small evidence envelope. Inside lay the blonde hair from the secret compartment, now compared under microscope to samples, taken from Blum's hairbrush that morning. Root sheath matches, same artificial dye, Stockholm blonde number 6, same microscopic damage from chronic thallium. Poirot's eyes gleamed like wet pebbles. Then the good doctor has been inside the Mermaid, but did he climb in to kill or to hide? They went at once to Blum's surgery in Österbro, a once elegant flat now stripped of everything valuable. The maid, pale and furious, admitted them. Drawers hung open, medical bags lay emptied. Blum had fled during the night. On the desk, however, he had left a letter addressed to Hercule Poirot in a shaking hand. "Monsieur, by the time you read this, I will be beyond Danish justice, perhaps beyond all justice. Yes, I poisoned Harold Grun. He discovered my forgeries 18 months ago and turned blackmail into an art. Every week he forced me to increase the dose of thallium in his own tonic. He claimed it sharpened the mind. In truth, he was poisoning me slowly, so I could never escape his net. My hair fell out in clumps. My hands shook so badly I could no longer hold a scalpel. He laughed and said I would die owing him money even in my coffin. Last month I reversed the bottles, a little more each day. He noticed nothing until the pain began. Then he understood and threatened to kill me himself. On the 16th, he summoned me to the Sirena at 11. I went carrying the final dose in a port bottle as a peace offering. He drank, gloated, told me I had only hours left. I panicked. The harpoon brackets caught my eye. I remembered the hollow mermaid from years ago, when Harold had the figurehead restored for a film company. In my terror, I dragged the harpoon to the secret panel, climbed inside, waited like a trapped rat. When he came on deck to smoke his last cigar, I opened the hatch and struck downward with all my remaining strength. Then I descended, bolted the door, and walked ashore across the gangplank no one thought to watch. I am not proud. I am only tired. Burn this letter or use it as you wish. The sea will have me soon enough. Einar Blum postscriptum. The mermaid sang that night. I heard her clearly. Perhaps she sang for both of us. The letter was dated 4 a.m. that same morning. Ink still faintly smelled of alcohol and despair. Müller swore softly in Danish. Confession and suicide note in one. Case closed? Poirot folded the letter with delicate precision. Non, mon ami. Too convenient, too complete. Observe, the handwriting matches the forged suicide note found on the Sirena. Same tremor, same pressure. Yet Blome claims he panicked and struck in the moment. A panicked man does not forge a perfect suicide note in Harold's own hand, nor plant a blonde hair dyed to implicate himself, nor leave a telegram trail pointing at Solvay Vang. He held up the confession. This is the third false confession in 2 days. Someone herds us like sheep. Müller stared. You think Blome is still alive? I think someone wishes us to believe the case finished, so we stop looking. And someone very clever has just made a serious mistake. Poirot opened Blome's medical bag, seized at the door by the maid. Inside, wrapped in cotton wool, lay an unopened ampule of thallium acetate and a small key of ornate brass. The key bore a tag, Serena, Four-Peak Locker. They returned to the yacht in a launch that cut through water the colour of steel. The Four-Peak Locker, beneath the crew quarters, had not been searched. It was used for spare rope and paint. The key turned sweetly. Inside, on a shelf once hidden by coiled hawser, lay a leather-bound ledger. Harold Grunn's real secret accounts. Page after page of bribes, smuggling profits, opium shipments masked as medical supplies. And on the final page, written only yesterday, if I die, everything goes to the museum. Let no one profit from my sins, least of all those who shared them. Below, 5 names, each with sums beside them. Captain Frederick Larsen, 400,000 kr. Ingrid Sørensen, 250,000 kr. Magnus Kjeldsen, 1,200,000 kr. Dr. Einar Blom, 180,000 kr. Solvay Vang, 20,000 kr. for silence. Poirot closed the ledger gently. Blackmail shared is blackmail doubled. They all fed at the same trough. Harold's death does not end the payments. It merely changes the paymaster. He looked out through the porthole toward the Mermaid Figurehead, now wrapped in canvas like a corpse. Someone among the 5 decided to become the only one. As the launch nosed back toward the quay, the fog lifted for one brief moment. Sunlight struck the canvas over the figurehead and, for an instant, the outline beneath looked less like a mermaid and more like a woman with her arms outstretched in warning, or welcome. Chapter 6. The Locked Will. The reading of the will took place at 3 o'clock in the mahogany-panelled offices of Advocat Hartwig Hansen on Bredgade. Outside, a cold rain slashed the windows like thrown gravel. Inside, the 5 suspects sat in a half-circle as though arranged for a firing squad. No one spoke. Only the ticking of a long-case clock and the occasional sob of Harold Grunn's ancient secretary broke the silence. The lawyer, tall, thin, and smelling faintly of formalin, opened a steel document box with ceremonial gravity. Gentlemen, madam, he began, the last will and testament of Harold Wilhelm Grun, signed and witnessed yesterday, the 16th of October 1936, at 11:45 in the morning, revokes all previous instruments. He adjusted his pince-nez and read in a voice that belonged in a crypt. I bequeath my entire estate, real and personal, including the shipping line, the houses in Copenhagen and Skagen, the yacht Sirena, and all moneys, to the National Maritime Museum of Denmark, to be held in perpetuity for the education of the Danish people. To my former associates, I leave nothing but the knowledge that their greed has built something that will outlast us all. Collective intake of breath. Captain Larsen half rose, face purple. Ingrid Sørensen's gloved hand flew to her mouth. Kjeldsen lit a cigarette with fingers that barely trembled. Bloom was still missing. An empty chair gaped like a missing tooth. Solvay Vang simply stared at the rain. Hartwig Hansen laid the document down. Signed in the presence of 2 witnesses, the night watchman Jens Petersen and the yacht's engineer, both of whom have confirmed Herr Grön was alone with them for exactly 7 minutes. The signature has been verified by 3 separate experts. Poirot, seated quietly in the corner, raised a small hand. Monsieur l'avocat, may one see the pen with which this historic document was signed? The lawyer produced a heavy onyx fountain pen from the box. Poirot examined it under a magnifying lens he drew from his waistcoat. Ah, a waterman with a cracked nib. Observe the microscopic split. Now regard the will itself. He turned to the signature page. The ink was black, bold, yet under the glass the final upstroke of the G showed a tiny tremor, a hesitation invisible to the naked eye. Harold Grunn's normal signature, I have seen 100 examples, flows like a ship under full sail. This one falters. The hand that wrote it was already dying. Captain Larson found his voice. "You are saying the will is forged?" "Non, Capitaine. I am saying it was written by a man in the grip of thallium poisoning, perhaps only hours from blindness and paralysis. A man who knew he had been murdered slowly and chose, in his last clear moments, to rob his murderers of their prize." Ingrid Sørensen laughed. A short, bitter sound. How noble, and how convenient for the museum. Poirot turned to her gently. "Tell me, madame, when you visited the Sirena 2 nights ago, yes, the engineer saw you leave at 10:30. Did you bring Harold a bottle of Sandeman 27 as a peace offering?" Her glacier eyes flickered. "I brought nothing. I was never aboard." "Yet the cork in the bottle beside his bed bears a thumbprint, a woman's thumbprint, and the left thumb of your glove, madame, has a trace of the same tawny port on the kid leather." She looked at her hand as though it belonged to someone else. Kjelsen exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Even if she brought the poison, the will was signed the morning before. She could not know he would change it. "Unless," Poirot said softly, "the change was Harold's idea entirely. The perfect revenge, to let his killers watch him drink their poison, then sign away everything they coveted while they still believed victory was theirs." He produced the secret ledger found in the forepeak locker and laid it open. "Your names are here, all of you. Harold was compiling evidence for the police. He intended to expose you at the board meeting next month. Death merely accelerated his philanthropy." Solveig Vang spoke for the first time, voice low. He mocked the sea's justice. The sea gave him its own. The lawyer gathered the papers. "Unless fraud is proven beyond doubt, the will stands. The museum takes possession tomorrow." As the meeting broke in confusion, Poirot drew Inspector Müller aside in the corridor. "One thing more, mon ami. The witnesses, Peterson and the engineer, claim Harold was alone with them for 7 minutes. Yet the appointment diary on the yacht shows a visitor at 11:30. I.S. Final settlement. Ingrid Sørensen." Müller's eyes narrowed. "She was with him when he signed the will? Or immediately after? Long enough to watch him drink the poisoned port she brought. Long enough to see the pen tremble and know the thallium had done its work. Outside the rain had stopped. A weak sun glittered on wet pavements. Poirot paused on the steps. Tomorrow the Sirena becomes museum property. Tonight someone will try to destroy the last evidence, the hollow mermaid herself. She has seen too much." He looked up at the sky, where gulls wheeled like white scraps of the will itself. "Arrange surveillance, Inspecteur, but discreet, very discreet. The fish is swimming toward the net, and the net must appear to be made of fog." Far across the city, in the locked saloon of the Sirena, the gramophone needle rested on the silent record. Yet for one heartbeat, the figurehead on the bowsprit seemed to turn her carved head, as though listening for footsteps that had to not yet come. Chapter 7. the Hollow Mermaid. The night of 19th of October 1936 was black as wet slate. A wind off the Öresund drove cold rain in horizontal sheets across Nyhavn, emptying the cafes and sending even the hardiest sailors to their bunks. At 1:30 in the morning, the Sirena lay alone at her mooring. Riding lights dimmed, deck watch dismissed by order of the museum for insurance reasons. Only one small lamp burned in the saloon, visible through the porthole like a watchful eye. Hercule Poirot stood in the shadow of a stack of fish barrels 50 meters away, collar up, Homburg pulled low. Beside him, Inspector Müller shivered inside a fisherman's oilskin 2 sizes too large. "Patience, mon ami," Poirot whispered. "The murderer always returns to the wound." At 1:47 a.m., a figure appeared on the quayside. Tall, hooded, moving with the careful gait of someone who knows every loose cobble. A dark lantern glimmered once, then vanished. The figure crossed the gangplank soundlessly and disappeared below. Müller reached for his whistle. Poirot's gloved hand closed on his wrist. "Attendez! Let the rat enter the trap entirely." Minutes crawled. Then came the scrape of metal on wood, followed by a muffled oath. A thin blade of light stabbed upward from the foredeck as the canvas shroud over the figurehead was pulled aside. The hooded figure climbed the bowsprit with surprising agility, carrying a small bundle that clinked softly. Tools. Poirot nodded. They moved. They boarded silently from the stern, shoes wrapped in rags. The companionway door stood ajar. Inside the saloon, the lamp had been turned low. Shadows leapt like guilty things. The false panel behind the chart table yawned open. A rope ladder dangled into darkness. From the Hollow Mermaid came the rhythmic rasp of a saw. Poirot stepped into the saloon and spoke into the cavity, voice calm and terrible in its politeness. "Bonsoir, Dr. Blum, or should I say good morning? You are, I think, a little early for your resurrection." The sawing stopped. A choked sound echoed inside the wood. "Descend, Docteur. Slowly. My friend has a revolver and a most unsentimental disposition." A moment later, Dr. Einar Bloom crawled out, pale as the belly of a fish, eyes red-rimmed, the last of his dyed hair hanging in wet strands. He carried a small hacksaw and a tin of paraffin. His hands shook so violently the saw blade rattled against the teak. I only wish to remove the evidence," he stammered. "The cavity, my fingerprints, the hair." Poirot regarded him with clinical pity. "You have been a busy corpse, Docteur. First the confession letter, then the dramatic flight, now arson upon a national treasure. Almost convincing, if one did not know that dead men do not saw wood at 2 in the morning. Blom collapsed into a chair, head in hands. "It was not meant to be like this. Harold forced my hand." "Non," Poirot interrupted gently. "Someone forced yours." He knelt and shone his torch into the Hollow Mermaid. The ancient harpoon was gone, removed by police days ago, but fresh saw cuts scarred the inner walls. And there, wedged behind a rib of oak, something glinted. A woman's silk scarf, pale rose, monogrammed I.S. Ingrid Sørensen. Poirot drew it out with tweezers. "Curious. You came to destroy evidence, yet you bring more. This scarf has been missing since the murder. Someone placed it here tonight, after you climbed in, perhaps. Someone who knew you would come, because someone sent you the anonymous note this evening, promising that if you burned the figurehead, the case would die with it." Bloom stared, comprehension dawning like poison. She telephoned me, said the cavity contained papers that would hang us both, said the police were coming at dawn. I believed. Of course you did. You were meant to." Poirot turned to Müller. Arrest him for attempted destruction of evidence, but gently. He is a pawn, not the queen." As Bloom was led away, Poirot lingered inside the hollow space. It smelled of cedar, old blood, and now of fresh paraffin. He ran his fingers along the inner surface and paused. A small brass plate, no larger than a postage stamp, had been screwed to the wood very recently. Engraved upon it, for H.G., the sea always collects. I.S. 1936. He unscrewed it carefully. Behind the plate lay a folded slip of paper, the real reason someone had lured Bloom here tonight. Poirot unfolded it beneath his torch. A single line, in Harold Grun's dying hand. "The one who brings the poison will stand beneath the mermaid at the full moon. Watch, the next full moon was tomorrow night." Poirot emerged onto the deck. The rain had stopped. Stars showed cold and bright between racing clouds. The mermaid figurehead, half sawn and scarred, seemed almost to lean forward, listening. "Tomorrow," Poirot said to the knight, "the last act. The murderer will come to collect the final debt, believing the board is swept clean." He looked at the scarf in his hand, then at the empty place where Bloom had stood. "Two widows," he murmured, "one who lost a husband to the sea, and one who lost a victim to justice. Only one of them still believes mermaids can be bought with blood." Far down the harbour, a bell-buoy tolled once, slow and mournful, as though the sea itself were clearing its throat before speaking the final truth. Chapter 8. The Widow Beneath the Moon. The full moon of 20th October 1936 rose over Copenhagen like a silver coin pressed against black velvet. It turned the harbour into a mirror of itself. Every mast, every rope, every ripple duplicated in cold fire. The Sirena floated in the centre of this doubled world, her white hull ghostly, the scarred mermaid figurehead gleaming as though newly carved. At 11:30, Hercule Poirot stood alone on the foredeck, hands clasped behind his back, overcoat buttoned to the throat. Inspector Müller and 6 armed men waited below, invisible in the shadows of the saloon. The gramophone had been rewound. The mermaid's song rested on the turntable, needle poised. Tonight the trap would be sprung by a woman's voice older than Denmark itself. At 11:51, the gangplank creaked once, softly. High heels on wet teak, slow, deliberate. Ingrid Sørensen stepped into the moonlight, dressed in morning black that drank the light. In her gloved hand she carried a small portmanteau. In the other, a revolver no larger than a toy, yet perfectly lethal at close range. She did not see Poirot at first. She walked straight to the foot of the bowsprit and looked up at the mermaid. "I brought what you asked for, Harold," she whispered to the empty air. "The ledger is burned. The doctor will hang. Everything is finished, just as you wanted." She opened the portmanteau. Inside lay the secret ledger, or what remained of it. Half the pages charred, the rest soaked with paraffin. She had done the burning herself that afternoon in her apartment fireplace. Poirot spoke from the darkness behind her. "Madam, you mistake wood for conscience. The mermaid hears nothing tonight except the wind." Ingrid spun, revolver rising. Moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks. "You," she said, voice cracking like thin ice. "Always you." "Always order, always method," Poirot replied calmly, stepping into the silver circle. "You arranged everything with exquisite care. The slow thallium in Harold's tonic, administered by poor Dr. Bloom, who thought he was merely paying interest on a debt. The final dose in the port you brought 2 nights ago. The forged suicide note in Harold's hand, written by you while he lay dying on this very deck, pen forced between his paralyzed fingers." He took another step, then the clever touches. The blonde hair dyed to implicate Bloom, the scarf planted tonight to lure him back, the false confession left for us to find. You even used Solveig Vang's legend, her song, her childhood terror, to persuade us the sea itself had taken revenge. Ingrid's hand trembled, but the revolver stayed level. "He murdered my husband," she said. 5 years ago, he loosened the lashings on Eric's safety line during the storm. I watched from the bridge. Harold wanted the company alone. When I threatened to speak, he laughed and said the sea keeps its own counsel. Then he cut me from the will, kept me like a pet. I waited, monsieur. I waited until the pain in his joints was unbearable, until his hair fell out in clumps, until he begged me for the antidote that did not exist. Her voice dropped to a whisper. On the last night he crawled on deck, half-blind, calling for his brother. I opened the hatch in the mermaid's breast, the hatch he showed me years ago when we were lovers, and I drove the old harpoon down with both hands. He looked up at me and smiled, actually smiled, as though death was the only mercy I could still give him. She laughed once, a terrible sound. Then I made him sign the new will. His hand shook so badly I had to guide it, but the lawyers never noticed. Everything to the museum. No one profits. Perfect justice. Poirot's eyes never left hers. And the telegram? The gramophone record left to play? The mermaid's song at dawn? I wanted the world to believe the curse was real, that the sea had judged him, not a woman. She raised the revolver higher. "Step aside, little man. The ledger burns tonight, and then I join Eric. The Sirena will have her captain and his widow at last." Poirot did not move. "No, madame. You join no one. Eric's body was recovered last year by a trawler off Bergen. He lives in Sweden under another name, rich with the insurance you collected. You poisoned Harold for love of money, not love of a ghost." For one heartbeat, the moon itself seemed to freeze. Ingrid's face crumpled. The revolver wavered. From the companionway came Muller's voice, steady and sad. "Drop it, Fru Sørensen. It is finished." The gun fell with a clatter. She sank to her knees before the mermaid, pressing her forehead to the cold wood, as though begging forgiveness from something that had never been alive. Poirot knelt beside her, voice gentle for the first time. "You wish to be the mermaid, madame. Beautiful, lethal, eternal. But mermaids are only wood and paint, and in the end, even they cannot hold a human heart." He stood and signalled. Constables emerged from the shadows. As they led her away, Ingrid looked back once at the figurehead. Moonlight caught the slow drip of condensation from the carved eyes, or perhaps something else. Poirot watched the launch carry her into the silver night. Then he turned to the mermaid, reached up, and with great care wiped the last tear from her cheek. "Enough weeping," he said softly. "The sea has its murderer. Let the rest of us sleep." Far out across the water, the bell buoy tolled once, as though in agreement. And for the first time since Harold Grun's death, the fog did not return. Chapter 9. The Little Grey Cells Speak. The saloon of the Sirena had been transformed into a courtroom of mahogany and moonlight. At 2 o'clock in the morning of 21st October 1936, the yacht rode at anchor in the middle of the harbour, away from prying quays and curious ears. Lamps burned low. The mermaid's scarred figurehead gazed in through the stern windows like a silent witness. Around the long table sat the 5 who had once stood to gain Captain Larsen, Magnus Kjeldsen, Dr. Einar Bloom, hands bandaged from paraffin burns, Solveig Vang, and between 2 impassive constables, Ingrid Sørensen, no longer veiled, face pale and composed, eyes fixed on nothing. Hercule Poirot stood at the head of the table, small, immaculate, green eyes luminous. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he began, voice soft yet carrying to every corner. "Tonight we end the comedy of the Weeping Mermaid. You have all played your parts admirably. The grieving widow, the betrayed captain, the ruined doctor, the vengeful rival, the prophetess of the sea. But only one of you wrote the entire play." He placed 5 objects on the table with the care of a priest laying out relics. First, the rose silk scarf monogrammed I.S. Second, the forged suicide note in Harold Grunn's dying hand. Third, the brass plate hidden inside the mermaid, engraved with Ingrid's promise. Fourth, the half-burnt secret ledger. Fifth, a single long blonde hair sealed in glass. "These," Poirot said, "are the notes of a symphony composed by Fru Ingrid Sørensen." He turned to her. "You poisoned Harold slowly, using poor Dr. Bloom as your unwitting cupbearer. When the thallium began to cripple him, you brought the final dose in the port on the 16th. You watched him drink, then forced the pen into his paralyzed fingers to sign the museum will, his last act of spite guided by your hand." Ingrid said nothing. Her silence was regal. "Then you staged the impossible murder. You knew the secret of the Hollow Mermaid from years before, when Harold trapped Solveig Vang inside as a cruel joke, and later, in happier days, showed you the cavity as a lover's hiding place. On the night of the 16th, you waited inside the figurehead, harpoon ready. When Harold crawled on deck, half mad with pain calling for his brother, you struck." Poirot lifted the scarf. "This you left deliberately months ago, knowing one day it would serve as evidence. You planted the dyed blonde hair to implicate Bloom. You sent the telegram in Solveig's style. You started the gramophone at 3 a.m. to persuade the watchman a ghost walked. He moved to Dr. Blom. You, Doctor, discovered the poisoning too late and tried to reverse it, thus poisoning yourself. In panic you wrote the confession I received, but it was Ingrid who dictated every word, promising you escape if you played the guilty man." Blom nodded, broken. Captain Larsen stared at the table. Kelson smoked furiously. Solveig Vang's eyes never left Ingrid. Poirot continued. "The masterstroke was the museum will. By making Harold appear to die in noble renunciation, you ensured none of his blackmail victims would profit. You even burned the real ledger tonight to bury the proof that all of us here shared his crimes." He produced one final item. A photograph from the warehouse, showing young Solveig trapped inside the mermaid while Harold laughed. "This picture gave you the idea. You turned Solveig's childhood terror into your perfect smokescreen. You used her song, her legends, her very soul." Solveig spoke at last, voice like winter. "You stole my nightmare and made it your weapon." Ingrid met her gaze. "Nightmares belong to whoever dares use them." Poirot raised a hand. "Enough. The mechanics are clear. The motive also, not only money, but hatred refined for 5 years. Harold murdered your first husband for the company. He kept you as ornament. He threatened to expose your affair with Eric's insurance fraud. You waited until the pain equaled yours, then gave him a death that would be remembered for centuries." He turned to the others. "You are all guilty of complicity in silence, but only one of murder. Fru Sørensen, you planned a perfect crime. Perfect, that is, if you had not reckoned with Hercule Poirot." Ingrid looked up then, and for the first time she smiled. Small, cold, almost admiring. "You are clever, little Belgian, but tell me this. When the courts are finished with me, when the sirena is polished and displayed for schoolchildren, who will remember Harold Grun as anything but the man killed by the mermaid's curse? In 100 years the legend will be all that remains. I have won." Poirot regarded her for a long moment. "Non, madame. Legends belong to the innocent. You have given the mermaid a story, yes, but one that ends in a prison cell. The wood does not care, the sea does not care. And tomorrow the sun will rise on Copenhagen exactly as it has for 1,000 years, indifferent to us all. He signalled to the constables. As Ingrid was led away, she paused beside the gramophone. With a sudden, defiant gesture, she dropped the needle. The mermaid's song filled the saloon once more, low and heartbreaking. Der Saden have fru på klippen den rød. Poirot let it play to the end. When the final note died, he lifted the record, snapped it neatly in two, and laid the pieces on the table. Silence, he said quietly, is sometimes the only mercy we can offer the dead. Above them, the scarred mermaid stared through the stern windows at the departing launch, moonlight silver on her wounded breast. And for the first time since the murder, she did not weep. Chapter 10. Justice on the Tide. The fog had finally surrendered. For the first time in 10 days, the sky over Copenhagen was the colour of pale aquamarine, and the harbour lay so still it might have been painted glass. The Saruna had been towed overnight to the museum dock at Tolboden. Workmen in blue overalls were already swarming over her, polishing brass, repairing the scarred figurehead, erasing every trace of blood and violence. By spring she would open to the public. Children would climb the companionway. Scholars would measure the mermaid's carved smile, and the name Harold Grun would become a footnote beneath a brass plaque that read simply, Donated 1936. Hercule Poirot stood alone on the quayside, hands clasped behind his back, watching the last act of the drama play itself out without him. Captain Frederick Larsen approached first. The old sailor had shaved, put on a clean uniform borrowed from the museum, and somehow looked 20 years younger. The director had offered him the honorary post of custodian of the Serena, a salary, a cabin aboard, the right to salute the flag every morning. He stopped 2 paces from Poirot and removed his cap. "I have no words, monsieur. You gave me back my ship." Poirot smiled. "You gave her 35 years of your life, mon capitaine. The sea is just in the end." Larsen's eyes were wet. "They say the mermaid will be repaired. Good. Wood forgets. Men should too." He saluted stiffly and walked up the gangplank, boots ringing on teak that knew his step better than any wife's heartbeat. Magnus Kjeldsen came next, hat in hand, sleekness dulled by sleepless nights. The shipping line would be sold piecemeal to pay death duties. His grand offer had died with Harold. He looked suddenly smaller. "I lost everything," he said, attempting a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Still, better a live pauper than a rich corpse, eh?" Poirot regarded him without warmth. "Some men measure wealth in ships, Monsieur Kjeldsen. Others in the ability to sleep without dreaming of harpoons. Bon voyage." Kjeldsen walked away toward a waiting taxi, shoulders hunched against a future that smelled of failure instead of salt. Dr. Einar Blum was brought from the cells under escort, pale but steady. The charges against him had been reduced to forgery and attempted arson. The confession had been Ingrid's forgery, not his. He would serve perhaps 3 years, then be struck off the medical register forever. He stopped before Poirot. "I poisoned no one knowingly," he said quietly, "but I looked away too long. Thank you for seeing the difference." Poirot inclined his head. "Even rats deserve the truth, Doctor. Go, and sin no more against the living." Solveig Vang appeared last, carrying a small bundle wrapped in blue sailcloth. She had not slept. Her black hair was loose, moving like seaweed in the breeze. She unwrapped the bundle on the bollard. A new carving, no longer than a man's hand, a mermaid with Ingrid's proud face and weary eyes. "I carved it last night," she said, "not for vengeance, for memory. The sea keeps all stories, even the ugly ones." She placed a single white lily at the foot of the figurehead, now half restored, the saw cuts filled, the wood pale and new. "The 100-year debt is paid," she whispered to the carving. "Sleep now." Then she turned to Poirot. "You do not believe in mermaids, monsieur." "I believe in order, Mademoiselle Vang, and in mercy. Tonight the order is restored. The mercy, that is yours to give the legend." She nodded once, pressed the small carving into his hand, and walked away toward the city that was already forgetting. Finally, as the church bells of Vorfrukirke struck 8, a prison van drew up. Ingrid Sørensen stepped out in handcuffs, dressed in plain grey, hair cut short for the trial photographs. She looked neither right nor left until she stood before the Serena. The constables paused. Ingrid raised her eyes to the figurehead. The workmen had done their job well. The mermaid smiled again, serene, untouched. Ingrid spoke so softly only Poirot heard. "Tell them I was beautiful once." Poirot met her gaze. "You are lethal, madame. Beauty was never the question." A faint smile touched her lips, the same smile she had given Harold in his final moment. "Then tell the sea I kept my promise." She was led back to the van. As it pulled away, the sun cleared the rooftops and struck the mermaid full in the face. For one instant, the carved eyes flashed like living things, and a single drop, condensation perhaps or something older, slid from the lower lid and fell into the harbour without a sound. Poirot watched until the van disappeared. Then he opened his hand and looked at the tiny mermaid Solvay had given him. With a small, precise movement, he dropped it over the side. It bobbed once, twice, then sank beneath the clear water, hair streaming like black fire. He adjusted his hat, turned his back on the Serena, and began the long walk toward the city and the train that would take him south, to warmth, to order, to the next impossible crime. Behind him, the workmen raised the Danish flag on the Serena's stern. It caught the breeze, snapped once, and hung bright against the sky. And for the first time since 1836, the mermaid figurehead did not weep at all.